Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this lunchtime session. It's an in-conversation session on making research practice more inclusive. I'm Lee Chan. I'm a trustee of the SRA, and I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting this session with two research experts whom I admire greatly. That's Marie-Claude Gervais and Reema Patel, both of whom I'll tell you about in a second. I need to tell you that the format of this session is new for the conference. We hope it's fairly informal nature, lends itself well to your online experience today. There will be no PowerPoint, simply a conversation between two knowledgeable people on an issue that we all feel very passionate about. So let me very quickly tell you a bit about each speaker. Marie-Claude Gervais is a multi-award winning researcher and strategist and is co-founder of one of the UK's most successful agencies specialising in research with people from diverse backgrounds. We're really grateful for Marie-Claude for giving her time today because she's just started a new post as director at the foundation, where she will carry on amplifying minority voices to drive innovation and performance through both research and consultancy, and accelerate change by getting closer to senior decision makers. So very exciting for you. Good luck in that, Marie-Claude. Reema Patel is an associate director in public engagement at the Lovelace Institute. That's an independent organisation seeking to ensure that data and AI work for people and society. There, Reema leads the organisation's public attitudes and public deliberation research and its broader engagement work on justice and equalities, seeking to inform the Institute's overall agenda to convene diverse voices. So two brilliant speakers here who've probably got far too much to say in the time allowed. I also need to say that you'll notice that this year's conference has two sessions which unashamedly focus on issues of inclusion. So this session is about how to make research practice more inclusive, but please do have a look at the other session, which is about making research organisations more inclusive. I mean, why choose? Watch both when you can. So without further ado, we're going to get into this conversation and try and cover quite a lot of ground. And we're trying to cover a few themes here. The first theme, I wanted to first ask you, Marie-Claude, and that's about really trying to identify who needs to be included in research so we can genuinely say it's inclusive research. And this is about designing in relevant perspectives. So what's your experience and your approach to doing this?
I'm so glad that you're asking that question, because really identifying whose voices need to be included in the research is 3/4 of the art, in a sense. Often it's that first step is not really recognized. So it's really looking at, from a service perspective, a communication challenge perspective, a policy perspective, who is seldom heard, who is at risk, who stands to benefit from a change in the status quo, whose voices are currently excluded. And that's not about some kind of white savior syndrome, and it's not about kind of othering other people, but looking at existing inequalities, hypothesizing about the causes of these inequalities, really is what's going to determine how you go about the questions you ask and who you're going to bring into the conversation, and then the methods that you're going to use to bring people in a way that doesn't feel extractive, that doesn't feel like you're taking away from communities to serve your own agenda, in a sense, but acting generally as a force for good for them. So would be my overarching take on this.
That's great. And in terms of Reema, how does that apply to your world and the policy areas you work in? Sorry.
It's a really, really interesting question. It goes back to, so you asked about the research question and who is it that often gets to define or articulate the research question. And because we're often in spaces that are quite close to policy and power, there is always a risk that the research question is designed in a way that mirrors the expectation of people who are in positions of power. So at the Lovelace Institute, one of the things that we've sought to do is to really think about in the early stage definition of the research question, how do we involve, for instance, people who might have diverse gender identities in defining the questions around the future of biometric technologies? And how do we involve people from minority groups who may be disproportionately impacted in defining the future of biometric technologies, for instance? And I think the key to doing that well is to actually be fairly open. It's really difficult to do, and it really pushes up against traditional research practice, but actually trying to be open-minded about the range or the possible research questions in mind, and open to iterating the research question as well. So I think that's something that we've learned enormously in terms of the approaches that we take, recognizing that research organizations are often situated as power holders in quite a privileged landscape. So thinking about what does it mean to reinforce that point, go to and collaborate and co-produce with communities, impacted communities, rather than to bring people into spaces that may feel quite exclusionary or elitist. These are all important considerations at an early stage, but actually they run throughout.
Yeah, it sounds like then you need to really start early and it's a really important stage to do the thinking rather than rushing into things. Once you've decided who it is that really needs to be represented in research and which voices need to be heard, there are also issues about how do you approach people? What are the sort of the routes to including the right people? Some of these might be non-traditional or non-standard, and what are effective incentives? Because if people are disengaged or have always been used to not being asked, how do you genuinely get them to participate and trust you? So that's the next set of questions I've got to pose. Sorry, there's so many. Marie-Claude, what are your views on those issues?
So maybe the best thing is to answer that in reference to projects, because I think in a sense, the answer is always quite specific to each project. So a while back, I approached Macmillan Cancer Support because I was aware that there were cancer inequalities across the cancer journey. This was documented in national surveys of cancer patient experiences. And I could see that people from ethnic minority backgrounds, LGBTQ plus people, and older people aged 65 to 90 were all reporting worse experiences in cancer services and had worse outcomes. So they were more likely to die, basically, or to be more negatively impacted by cancer. So I approached Macmillan. I said, what are you doing about this? So again, asking the right question, but then understanding specific challenges. So knowing that LGBTQ plus people with cancer are going to be hard to find, right? And for very many reasons, and same for ethnic minorities or older people, whether it's to do with the sheer geographical spread, it's about distrust, it could be about taboos around talking about cancer, it can be the conditions of cancer itself, the fatigue, the illness, the fact that you're in hospital, in and out. How do you engage people like that in research? So what we did was, we knew that cancer patients with those profiles would not be on consumer panels. So then what do you do? So we sent an email to 600,000 people who had registered to be on health panels to see how we might recruit people that way and ask people to snowball through that first mechanism. Then we liaise with national cancer charities that were relevant. We liaise with local cancer groups, with local community groups that specifically support either ethnic minority people, older people, or LGBTQI plus people. And then we also activated Macmillan's own cancer patient network, but we wanted to go beyond that because we wanted to hear new voices, right? So understanding the challenges that impact on a project will guide you through the best mechanism, but usually using community networks is a good kind of shorthand.
Yeah. So again, it feels like you need to allow quite a bit of time and have really open-minded approach to getting beyond the usual suspects and get into these quite specialist groups. Reema, what's your experience on some of the research you've done at ADA?
It's really interesting to go back to this question around data and AI type type issues. One of the dominant issues in data and AI is the problem of missing data, the underrepresentation of marginalised group, people from ethnic minority background, people who are experiencing clinical vulnerability, and so on. And here, trying to think about or work on strategies to ensure that voices are included when we already know the data sets are themselves underrepresented is really interesting. The other challenges around overrepresentation. So a science-wise dialogue sought to overrepresent people, young men from ethnic minority background, because they identified in the data set the overrepresentation of young men from ethnic minority background. So there's something about, I think it's called purposive sampling, but really thinking about what it is that you're working on, and thinking who's missing from this conversation, defining clearly who that is, and who's overrepresented or adversely impacted from that conversation, defining clearly what that looks like, and then reflecting that in the sample. So I think there's a really interesting piece which is moving beyond the stratified sample debate towards recognising that there's underrepresentation, overrepresentation, and sometimes stratified sample are super useful, but other times they may not be appropriate or relevant to the issue being discussed at hand. So that's a classic example, the national DNA database or databases where we've identified as a research community that particular groups and communities are impacted. Recently, we ran citizen juries on the use of data and health inequalities, and one of the things that we did was actively in the purposive sample recruit for people who were on the shielded patient list and clinically that kind of thing. So that's again a good example of how to do this well.
Right, thank you so much. I can see a future webinar called Going Beyond the Stratified Sample. So I'm going to contrive to set that webinar up. It's quite a catchy title. I think this is the bit that a lot of our participants are really interested in, which is understanding ways to capture lived experience of people whose voices have been marginalised, and how do you go about that? What are inclusive ways of capturing that experience? I'm sure there's too many to go through at the moment, but what are your favourites? Marie-Claude, what do you like to do?
So the first thing, actually this year, project we did won the MRS Audience Award at the MRS Impact, which was great because it was the one award for the whole conference, and it was actually praised because of the inclusive nature of what we've done, which was basically recruiting young people from diverse ethnic minority backgrounds to research the experiences and then lived experiences and the needs of other young people from ethnic minority backgrounds who were disproportionately impacted by COVID in terms of their employment prospects, right? So, and that's another case where I approached the client and I said, what are you doing about this? Because it's an important issue. So again, asking the right questions and then finding the approach that's going to work. So for me, peer research is really important. It's very time consuming. You need to really capacity build these young people in this case, get them DBS checked, give them some safeguarding training, all sorts of, training in digital research and qualitative research. So as you train your peer researchers, because they have shared experiences, you also want to control their biases. So all sorts of things that are kind of challenges that are interesting to navigate. But I would say my favorite approach is, whether it's face-to-face or online, is kind of a participant observation or ethnography. Because for me, it combines two really essential parts of the story. It's the participant and the observer. It's really that, right? The full contextualized experience of people who go about their lives and can give you loads of cues about what's going on, but you are also the expert, and combining that expert perspective and that lived experience within the same research process is where things, I think, are the richest. And having that, I'm obviously a qualitative researcher, so of course anything that has an open-ended quality, I think by definition, with seldom heard people, we've not heard them, we don't know enough about their reality, so we need to give them lots and lots and lots of space to articulate their circumstances and perceptions and needs.
I do love a bit of ethnography because, people say things, but they don't realize what they're doing and what's around them as well. So
it bridges the kind of the say-do gap, right? People say something, but actually you observe something very different. So it's, and both matter.
Yeah. And what about you, Reema? Do you like using the same things, or are there different things that you quite like to capture that lived experience and those voices?
It's really a good question there. So lived experience. So my starting point is that it's very personal to somebody, and recognizing that that's something that a person might want to share under particular terms and approaches, and taking quite a trauma-informed approach to lived experience can be quite difficult to share one's experience of, going through cancer or a family member experiencing that, for instance, and creating safe spaces in which that's possible to share, spaces where people feel they can trust the process and trust the research institution to use some of that insights well. They feel they're getting something out of it as well. I think that's really important, coming back to the point about extractive, and ethnography is a really interesting one because it's being critiqued for being extractive. It's placing the researcher in the position of observing. That's not to say I think that ethnography can't be valuable. I just think there's something about how do you do that in a way that ensures that, for instance, the people who are in a part of the observation process are shaping it too, that they are involved in the observing, so that kind of things like diaries and reflection and journaling and story walks and really interesting approaches that are percolating here. The other thing that we've been discussing a lot at ADA is the field sites. So, the notion of observing interactions between people, interactions between yourself and a place has really dramatically shifted in the pandemic. And we're sort of increasingly thinking of the field site as not just in a place, but between people and a place that might be virtual or offline. So, or as an extension of the offline world as well. So think about the pandemic response and the way we organically shifted online and began to mediate our interaction online in the pandemic response. So I think there's a lot in there around how to do this well. I think there's other approaches too. So yes, there is a difference between what it is that people say and what it is that people do. But I'm quite interested in the intersection between the two things. How do we do this in a way that isn't just about surveilling people, but is about working with them to think about the implications for what next and purpose. Yeah. I think this is practice that hasn't really been defined yet, and I think there's something about methodological innovation here and what the next wave for ethnographic approaches might look like.
I don't know, Marie-Claude, I just wanted to let you in if you did know whether any advances had been there to sort of get that balance right, because I think listeners would want to hear about that.
I don't know if this really answers your point, but certainly I find that online research communities, of course, there are some people who might not, you'd have to top that up to include people who are digitally excluded. So let's kind of park that for a minute. But because I think often it's overplayed, a lot of people who are seldom heard are perfectly digitally included and could be part of a research process. They're just not asked, or they're assumed to not be online, which is a different kind of set of assumptions. But for me, I always, when I design an online community, I always do it over a period of time. So for Macmillan, it was 2 months of people really documenting their experiences, talking about the impact that cancer had had on all aspects of their lives, from the spiritual to relationships with their spouses, their sexual life, their children, their, of course, interactions with healthcare, their self-concept, all sorts of things. So it's about, and using a lot of projective techniques to get there, so that people articulate without being, they think differently about their experiences and define that in their own terms. And I know this project in particular had an independent external evaluation. And 95% of people thought it was transformative for them. And to me, that's the art of it, right? So when they just went, wow, thank you for helping me think about this and giving me the space, right? So I think, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that does. It's sort of like it's designing in the reflection, and so it gives people the chance to help combat that extractive kind of process where they're thinking about their own data, if you like, and what they're telling you. We're running out of time. We're at the 20-minute mark, but I feel like it would not be proper not to build on that point that you just made, Marie-Claude. So maybe just a couple of points each about how to drive change and make sure everybody benefits. And you've already mentioned that the research process should make people feel good. They should feel somehow rewarded through it. Are there any other ways that we can make sure we're driving change and make sure that people benefit from research? Can I go to you, maybe Reema, and then come back to Marie-Claude? Just a couple of points on that before we wrap up.
It's, again, great question. I think just in terms of developing research culture and systems that incentivize and reward this question, which is what has the impact been on the community, on and the benefit back to the people who've participated in the research. So when you look at evaluation framework, for instance, it often looks at impact on policy, I've noticed, or impact on research quality. And historically, the impact on those who've participated in the research has been deprioritized. So I think there's just something about what is it that we are measuring for and how do we find success and what does that look like, and this huge shift around, okay, we've worked these things out, but also it's really important that we value this as well, and also articulating why. And the why is that actually it's really difficult to build trust, to come back, to be able to involve and include people if they don't feel they benefited, that they feel that it has been this one-way process. So actually in the long term, it's not great for the quality of the research that we do. Those are my key takeaways on that point.
Yeah. And what about you, Marie-Claude? People will be listening keenly to anything that you might be able to share with them so that they can make sure they can drive change and people benefit from the research.
I think I would say that it's important that commissioners start by building time for activation, because if they came to an expert to do the research because they felt that they had a gap around something, that gap will carry on impacting on the implementation of the recommendation, right? So having that expertise very close to the commissioning team and on an ongoing basis, I think it's really important. I would say commissioners need to think about what I would call the deficit model of communities, thinking that there's something wrong with them that needs to be fixed, as opposed to actually introspecting a little bit and thinking, what is it about our processes that end up marginalizing and reinforcing that exclusion, right? So that introspection, I think, about our institutional ways of working is really important, as we're doing with respect to research just now in this conversation, right? Yes, promoting self-efficacy for the participants, I would say making it, if possible, so again in that Macmillan project, at the end we exported all the data for each person, their 2 months worth of data, and gave them their personal data file that they could carry on using and reflecting on, and and that was so powerful for many. Yeah. So you have to find creative ways of giving back somehow.
Absolutely. God, I've not heard of that. That's amazing. That would have been very revelatory for some people.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that. We have only scratched the surface of making research practice more inclusive. I'm absolutely sure we're going to come back to this in more detail and give it more airtime. But I think this is just to whet everybody's appetite and invite them to contact you both and have conversations with you both in the future. But for now, I'd like to thank you both, Marie-Claude and Reema, for being in conversation with me. And we're now going to have a look at some of the questions that have been posed through the chat during this conversation.
Thank you.